I'd spent a lifetime making people comfortable without them ever really seeing me, and that was about to become my greatest weapon. The apartment was quiet that Saturday morning, the kind of stillness that makes the ticking of a clock sound like a challenge. Henry Whitaker stood at his small kitchen counter, the gold pocket watch in front of him, its face catching the winter light. Preston Aldridge's words from the night before replayed in his mind, but they no longer burned. They sharpened into something useful. Years of working in service had taught him how to fade into a crowd, how to move so naturally through the edges of a room that no one questioned why he was there. That invisibility, the very thing Preston despised, would become the key to seeing his daughter marry. By 8:30, he was behind the wheel, heading toward the one place in Maplewood Heights that always felt like neutral ground. Marco De Luca's Italian Grill. He had been there so many mornings over the years, but this time, the drive felt different, purposeful. The streets were quiet, Christmas wreaths hanging on porch doors, frost glinting on rooftops. Henry pulled into the staff lot behind the restaurant and spotted Marco's familiar SUV parked at an angle only Marco would consider acceptable. Inside, the air smelled of fresh coffee and baking bread. Sunlight poured through the blinds, illuminating the dust motes that floated lazily above the polished wood tables. Marco was at the prep counter, slicing onions with the kind of precision that came from decades in a kitchen. He didn't look up right away. Henry knew better than to interrupt the rhythm. "You're early," Marco finally said, still cutting. "Saturday shifts don't start until 10. "Couldn't sleep," Henry replied, moving to pour 2 mugs of coffee. He added sugar to Marco's without asking some habits never changed. Handing it over, he said, "Antonio, sorry, Marco. I need to ask you something." Marco took the coffee, studying Henry over the rim of the mug. The lines around his eyes deepened in concern. "What troubles you, my friend?" Henry set the watch gently on the counter between them. "Tomorrow is Caroline's wedding." "Yes, at the Aldridge estate," Marco said. "Very fancy. You must be proud." "I am, but there's a problem." Henry leaned against the counter, the words tasting bitter as they came out. "Preston doesn't want me there. Says I'd embarrass him in front of his guests." Marco's knife stilled mid-slice. "He said this to you?" "Last night. Told me not to come to my own daughter's wedding." Marco's hands curled into fists. In his voice, Henry heard not just outrage for him, but echoes of every slight Marco had endured as an immigrant every time someone had looked through him as if he didn't matter. What kind of man turns away a father from his daughter's wedding? The kind who cares more about appearances than family. Henry straightened, meeting Marco's gaze. "That's why I need your help." Marco's brows lifted. "What can I do?" "I want you to get me into the wedding on the catering crew, just for tomorrow. I'll work the event, keep out of sight, but I'll be there when she walks down the aisle." Marco stared at him, like he'd suggested robbing the bank down the street. "Henry, that's insane. You want to serve drinks at your own daughter's wedding?" "It's the only way he can't stop me. Preston can't keep a hired waiter off the floor. I'll blend in like I've done 1,000 times before." Marco shook his head slowly. "A father should be in the front row, not refilling champagne glasses." "Sometimes we don't get what should be," Henry said quietly. "We take what we can get." Marco returned to slicing onions, his movements sharper now. The blade caught the light, flashing with each cut. "You really want to do this?" "I've never wanted anything more." The silence stretched, filled only by the hiss of onions hitting the hot pan on the stove. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled past, tires crunching over frost. Finally, Marco sighed. "The catering company is run by Giuseppe Torino. We worked together years ago. He owes me a favor." "Would he add me to the crew for tomorrow?" Henry asked, hope rising. "Yes, If I call him this morning. Marco wiped his hands on his apron. You're sure about this? Once you start serving those guests, there's no going back. No dignity in retreat. My dignity isn't the issue here, Henry said. Preston's is. Marco studied him for a long moment, then nodded. All right, I'll call Giuseppe. You'll work the wedding tomorrow. Relief washed over Henry like warm coffee on a cold morning. Thank you. I won't forget this. You're a good man, Henry Whitaker. If that future son-in-law can't see it, that's his blindness, not yours. Henry left the restaurant lighter than when he'd arrived, though the day ahead still loomed large. He drove home, imagining the ballroom, the polished silver, the clinking glasses, all the details he'd see from the other side of the celebration. If Preston thought he could bar him with a few sharp words, he didn't understand how determined a father could be. By late afternoon, the dining room at DeLuca's was set for the evening crowd. The crisp white tablecloths, neatly folded napkins, and gleaming glassware reminded Henry of what was at stake. He would be surrounded by the trappings of wealth and refinement tomorrow, but he wouldn't be there to admire them. He would be there to claim his place not in the way he had hoped, but in the way that was still possible. The phone rang in the back office, and moments later Marco stepped out with a small smile. Giuseppe says you start at 11 tomorrow. Wear black pants, white shirt, black vest. He'll have a bow tie ready for you. Henry nodded, the details falling into place like an arrangement he had rehearsed 100 times. Tell him thank you. Marco's eyes softened. You tell him yourself tomorrow. And Henry, don't let that man make you feel small. You've earned your place in this world. The smell of roasting garlic drifted in from the kitchen, mingling with the low hum of conversation as the first customers arrived. Henry moved through the motions of service, but his mind was already at the Aldridge wedding, picturing the moment Caroline would see him not in a suit, not as a guest, but as a man who refused to be erased. When his shift ended, he took the long way home, passing houses lit with holiday lights, the glow spilling onto snowy lawns. Each scene reminded him why he was doing this, not for vengeance, but for love, for the years no one else had seen, for the sacrifices that deserved to be honored even if they weren't recognized. He parked outside his apartment and sat for a moment, watching his breath cloud in the cold air. Tomorrow, he would walk into Preston's carefully curated world without an invitation, without permission, and without apology. If Preston wanted to keep him out, he'd have to look him in the eye and drag him from the room in front of every last guest. Henry smiled faintly at the thought. That was not a battle Preston Aldridge would win. If that man tries to push you out tomorrow, he'll have to go through me. He wasn't expecting to see me there, but the look on his face told me he'd already started plotting how to get rid of me. Afternoon sunlight slanted through the tall windows of Bella Vista's grand room, laying long bars of pale gold across white tablecloths. The hall smelled of floor polish, ironed linen, and roses, the kind bred to look perfect more than to breathe. Staff voices echoed lightly off the high ceiling as carts rattled by. Stacks of chargers clinked in porcelain soft syllables, and an industrial dishwasher in the back hissed like a distant train. Henry Whitaker moved through it the way a river glides around stones. Bow tie snug, vest neat, sleeves precisely creased. Each pass from table to table made the space more legible, chairs squared, silver set an inch from the edge, glassware aligned so a single line of chandelier light ran down their rims like a drawn blade. He had been here 100 times in other seasons, other lives. He knew where the draft sneaked under the exterior doors and which corner collected stray echo. The work steadied him. It dulled the lingering abrasion of last night's words and sharpened the resolve he had forged on that silent drive home. Be present, be invisible, be immovable. Near the far wall, He tugged a linen tight and let his fingertips skim the smooth cloth. In the pocket of his vest, the faint, reliable weight of a gold watch rested against his heart. The ticking was inaudible, but he could feel it all the same, as if time itself approved of the plan. The double doors at the front swung open. December air shouldered in first, crisp and faintly metallic, and then they entered. Caroline, cheeks brilliant with winter color and nerves, Preston Aldridge at her side, face arranged in practiced ease. Carolyn's sentiment wrapped the room instantly: concern, hope, the wish that today's meticulous order would inoculate tomorrow against chaos. Preston's energy was different. He scanned like a project manager and a customs agent rolled into one, inventorying with his eyes, assigning value, hunting risk. Caroline saw Henry first, her step hitched, the hope in her eyes lifted towards relief, then tensed again, as if she could feel the tug of two ropes knotted around her ribcage. "Dad?" she said, trying to make the word as ordinary as a greeting in a grocery aisle. Henry inclined his head. "Here to work, sweetheart," he said softly, careful that only she would hear. "Nothing more." Preston followed her gaze and stopped dead. For a beat, the only sound was the metallic clink of stacked chairs as another server wheeled them past. Then Preston's mouth curled into something like a smile that had lost its way. "What?" he said, each letter cleanly cut. "Are you doing here?" Henry set a water glass on the table and measured the inch to the plate, as if Preston had not spoken. When he did answer, he chose neutral weather. "Crew's short this weekend. Giuseppe asked me to help with setup." Caroline's hand found her fiancé's sleeve. "Preston." "This is manipulation," Preston said, voice rising a half step. He turned to Caroline but kept his eyes pinned on Henry, as if speaking to both and neither. "I made it clear last night. He is not to be at the wedding." "I'm here to work," Henry said, still even. "Guests will not notice me." "That is precisely the point." Preston took a step forward, lowering his tone to a confidential threat. "You want the optics of martyrdom. You want people to whisper that the poor father was forced to pour wine at his own daughter's reception." "What I want," Henry said, and the words surprised even him with how quiet they were, "is to see my daughter happy." The florist's assistant paused beside the head table, hands full of eucalyptus, sensing a storm she could not name. Carolyn's mouth opened, then closed. Henry saw the calculation flicker behind her eyes, the quick arithmetic of love and survival. If she defends him, what explodes? If she stays silent, what dies? Marco DeLuca emerged from the service corridor with a crate of polished flatware, set it down, and took in the tableau. Henry still as a lamppost, Preston taut as piano wire, Caroline braced between them like a bridge rumored unsafe. Marco shifted his stance so that he faced Preston squarely, his voice mild as bread, but with the weight of an oven behind it. "This is a place of work, Mr. Aldridge," he said. "We are preparing your celebration. Let us do our jobs." Preston's chin ticked toward Marco, disdain scanning the name tag and dismissing it. "I am speaking with him." "And I am speaking with you," Marco replied, not moving, not blinking. "Henry is assigned to this floor. Giuseppe signed him in." Color rose along the ridge of Preston's cheekbones. He pushed a hand through his hair, laugh scraping and humorless. "You all think I will be bullied in my own house tomorrow. I said what I said last night for a reason. People are coming who decide budgets for the city, who sit on boards, people who could change Caroline's career with a single coffee. I will not have a stunt undercut that." Henry arranged knives as if measuring land. "No stunt," he said. "A father with a job." Preston's gaze snapped to Caroline, hunting for affirmation, permission, a cue. "You're seeing this, right?" She stepped between them at last, a palm hovering near each chest, as if she could hold back tied with hands. "Please," she said. "Both of you. I want—" her breath caught. "I want tomorrow to be beautiful." "It will be beautiful," Preston said, words gentle but edged, "if certain people do not turn it into a morality play." Marco lifted the crate, the muscles in his forearms sketching long stories beneath his sleeves. "We are done here," he said, not unkindly, to no one and to everyone. He set the crate on a side station and reached to adjust a place card, his gesture a quiet claim to the ground. Preston took a step back, recalibrating. The smile returned, smoother this time. "Fine," he said, "if this is how you want it." He flicked an invisible thread from his cuff, and the cufflink caught the window light, throwing a coin of brilliance across the tablecloth. "But I will not let a farce unfold in front of my guests." He turned sharply and strode for the doors. Caroline tracked him with her eyes, then looked back at her father. Between them moved a dozen expressions: apology, love, dread, that childhood plea that says fix it, and that adult knowledge that says some things cannot be fixed, only endured. "I will stay out of your way," Henry said, the promise binding on both wrists. She nodded, throat tight, and followed Preston out, her heels counting their own private rosary across the polished floor. The room exhaled. Distantly, someone tested the microphone, and a warm buzz rolled through the ceiling speakers. A server slipped past with a tray of votives. Another bent to cut the tag from a chair sash. The ordinary returned, but it wore a different face now, one that had seen the future and flinched. Marco came to Henry's side, said nothing, and put a broad hand on his shoulder. The warmth landed like a benediction. For a long breath they stood together, the kind of male friendship that says more by not requiring language. "Keep placing," Marco murmured at last. "Let him chase his shadow." Henry did. He set forks and knives, lifted and replaced a glass that bore a single fingerprint until it did not. He moved to the head table and anchored the runner so it fell without ripple, smoothed a wrinkle from the bride's napkin, as if smoothing a wrinkle from the day she was born. He thought of a rental duplex, with a rattling heater and a crib he had assembled with hands tired from a double shift. Of the winter he had pawned a camera he loved to pay for a semester's books. He thought of the watch ticking, time's vote of confidence in stubborn hearts. Out through the front windows, twilight gathered early, diluting the hard lines of the parking lot into watercolor. On the portico, Henry caught motion. Preston pacing the slate, phone to his ear, the other hand slicing the air. His posture was the blueprint of control collapsing what had been smooth now cornered, what had been confident now bargaining. The glass of the door turned him into a silent film, mouth shaping orders, finger stabbing emphasis, a glance over his shoulder like a man who hears a sound that might be the first pebble before a landslide. Caroline stood several feet away, arms wrapped around herself against the cold, lips moving in a private conversation with the air. When Preston pivoted to face her, she lifted her chin. He gestured towards the room and toward Henry, and she shook her head, slow and aching, then looked down as if words had become a luxury too expensive for this hour. Inside, the florist finished the head table and stepped back. She tilted her head, considering, then shifted one white rose from the outer ring to the center and smiled, balance restored by an inch. Henry felt the strange pinch of gratitude for her small craft, the way such tiny changes could quiet a space. He adjusted one last place setting, stood to let his back unknot, and in the reflection of the window glass saw his own face, familiar and slightly grayer, framed by chandeliers that had no idea who he was. He bent to lift the crate of extra napkins and felt the friendly ache in his lower spine that announced a life of honest work. The ache was a kind of compass, a needle that always found north. You have done real things with your body. You have held the world up at least as much as it has tried to press you down. Behind him, the double doors banged lightly against their soft stops. A tangle of winter struck with Preston's return, his coat unbuttoned, his tie slightly loosened in a gesture that tried to read casual and landed on frayed. He did not come near Henry. He spoke to Giuseppe at the far station with the kind of intensity that leaves burn marks. He spread his hands. He leaned close. Giuseppe listened with the equilibrium of a man who had stood over boiling pots long enough to learn not to flinch at steam. Moments later, Giuseppe crossed to Henry, clipboard tucked like a shield. "You good?" he asked, sotto voce. "I am," Henry said. "Stay on the floor," Giuseppe added, eyes flitting briefly to Preston and back. "We run our plan." Henry nodded. They returned to their orbits, the manager tracking lists, the servers ghosting along aisles, the friend at the side station polishing spoons with the concentration of a violinist tuning his instrument. The light slipped from gold to blue, and the room's chandeliers took over, throwing a warm net over all that waited here. Vows, music, pride, shame, grace. At the very end of the hour, as staff began to drift toward the back for a quick break, and the kitchen doors started their pre-dinner dance, Henry moved to the window again. Outside, Preston had retreated to the far end of the portico, phone still at his ear, steps tracing a groove that had not been there in the stone this morning. He was a man calling in favors he assumed eternal, discovering which ones were made of paper. Every few seconds, he glanced at the doors as if expecting them to spit out a different future than the one he had set rolling. Henry drew a breath that felt like opening a door to clean air at the top of old stairs. He pressed a palm to the vest where the watch lay, and felt, not the tick, but the beat in his own chest answer it. If Preston wanted to believe this was a war of optics, he could. Henry knew it was a contest of presence. One man would spend the night trying to control who belonged. The other would simply keep belonging until the room itself acknowledged the fact. He surveyed the room one last time, the chairs aligned, the runner smooth, the roses breathing their pale breath into the edges of the evening, and tucked a folded list into his pocket. The dishwasher hissed again, and somewhere in the back, a radio whispered a carol that sounded older than advertising. Marco brushed past and, without looking, knocked his knuckles once against Henry's arm. Here, here, here. Henry straightened his tie in the window's reflection and watched the man outside lift his phone again, harder, like a hammer. If he wanted a battle, tomorrow he'd get one on my terms. By mid-morning, the flowers were in place, the silverware gleamed, and Preston Aldridge was already trying to erase me from the building. The December sun hung low and cold, spilling a pale light through Bella Vista's tall windows as the day began to take shape. The ballroom was a study in winter elegance, white roses arranged in cascading towers, eucalyptus draped in measured arcs, crystal flutes catching the light so sharply they looked carved from ice. In the kitchen, the metallic percussion of pans and knives set a rhythm, while on the floor, the quiet hum of preparation was a language everyone spoke fluently. Henry Whitaker stood at the service station near the west wall, polishing the last set of glassware with methodical precision. His black vest felt snug but not constricting, the bow tie tight against his throat, the uniform rendering him one of many exactly as he needed to be. Every fold in the table linens, every place card resting at an exact 45 degrees, was another step toward invisibility. That was the plan. To be so seamlessly woven into the fabric of the event that Preston couldn't pull a single thread without unraveling the whole thing. It was just past 10:30 when the change in the room's temperature announced him. Preston Aldridge entered without removing his coat, his shoes clicking sharply on the polished floor, eyes sweeping the space like a man appraising a property. He spotted Henry almost instantly. For a beat, the two men regarded each other across the breadth of the ballroom, the distance a thin disguise for the thick air between them. Preston strode toward the catering station where Giuseppe Torino, the catering manager, was organizing the service list. His voice was low at first, pitched for privacy, but Henry caught enough to read the scene. "Take him off your roster," Preston said, jerking his chin subtly toward Henry. "I don't care how you replace him. Pay someone else overtime." Giuseppe didn't look up from his clipboard. "Crew's set. We're full today." "Then make it unset," Preston countered, the measured calm in his tone beginning to fray. "I'll cover his day rate plus a bonus. Generous bonus." Giuseppe finally met Preston's gaze. "It's not about money. He's working the job I hired him for." Henry continued to polish glasses, his movements steady, but the exchange painted itself in his periphery. Preston's voice dipped into something colder. "You think this is about a shift? It's about a wedding with high-profile guests. Optics matter." Giuseppe's reply was level, but there was an edge of steel under it. "Optics won't set the tables or carry the trays. He stays." Preston exhaled through his nose, an imitation of composure. "Fine. If money won't do it, remember this: city inspectors, liquor licenses, board connections. Things can change fast in this town." That was the moment Marco De Luca appeared from the side entrance, carrying a crate of utensils like it weighed nothing. He set it down between them, the placement deliberate, as if drawing a border neither man was meant to cross. "Henry's on the schedule," Marco said, voice casual but eyes locked on Preston. "Giuseppe says he's working. That's the end of it." Preston turned toward Marco, lips curling in a faint, humorless smile. "I suppose you're part of this stunt?" Marco shrugged. "I'm part of making sure the staff can do their jobs without threats. Call it whatever you want." For a moment, Preston simply looked at them, the silence in his stare almost louder than his words. Then he smoothed his tie and stepped back, though the tension clung to him like static. "Enjoy the day while it lasts," he said, and turned toward the exit. The glass doors sighed shut behind him, letting in a thin draft of winter air. Giuseppe looked at Henry. "You good?" Henry gave a single nod. "Better than he is." Work resumed, but the energy in the room had shifted. Staff exchanged glances as they passed, not openly curious, but aware. Henry kept his head down, folding napkins, filling water pitchers, adjusting chairs by inches. Every movement was part of a rhythm older than this wedding, older than Preston's arrogance, years of service condensed into muscle memory. By noon, the last floral arrangement was in place. The silverware gleamed like small weapons under the light, and the kitchen was a measured chaos of trays being plated and garnishes applied. Henry moved between the ballroom and the kitchen, ferrying pitchers, checking tables, and quietly making himself indispensable. It was on one of these trips that he caught sight of Preston again, this time outside on the covered portico, phone pressed to his ear, pacing with short, clipped strides. Henry didn't need to hear the words to know they were meant to tighten a net he'd already decided wouldn't catch him. Marco passed by carrying a tray of glass candle holders. "He's making calls," Marco murmured, without slowing. "Trying to close a door that's already open." Henry smiled faintly, not at Marco, but at the truth of it. "Let him," he said. And then he went back to work, aligning the last row of chairs so they matched as perfectly as the stitches on his vest. Everyone a quiet declaration that he was already exactly where he was meant to be. If Preston wanted to keep him out, he would have to drag him out in front of every guest, every camera, every whispering mouth. That, Henry knew, was a fight Preston would never risk. He stepped back from the finished table, taking in the symmetry of the room, the balance, the perfection built by invisible hands like his own. And he knew before the night was over, his invisibility would be the very thing Preston could not control. Let him make his calls. By tonight, I'll be standing exactly where I belong. In a room full of silk gowns and $1,000 suits, I was invisible until Preston made sure every eye was on me. The December evening outside Bella Vista was already deepening into blue when the first guests arrived. A procession of dark overcoats, polished shoes, and careful smiles. Inside, the chandeliers glowed warmly, reflecting off crystal and silver, every table a small universe of symmetry, the scent of roses mixed with the faint spice of mulled wine drifting from the bar. Henry Whittaker moved through it all with the same measured grace he had honed over decades straight back. Quiet step, eyes always scanning for the next glass to fill. He'd been assigned to the champagne service, which kept him circulating from the ballroom entrance to the head table. Guests took their flutes with polite murmurs, barely glancing at the man offering them. That was how it had always been, and tonight it was exactly what he wanted. To slip between them unseen. To watch without being watched. Carolyn was radiant at the head table, her gown soft and flowing like snowfall, her hair swept back with the same elegance Henry remembered from childhood recitals when she'd insisted on grown-up hairstyles. She caught his eye once, a fleeting, grateful glance, and then returned to smiling at the guests filing past her. Preston stood beside her, the perfect host, shaking hands, exchanging practiced greetings. He didn't look Henry's way at first. By the time the room was nearly full, Henry had mapped its rhythms. Conversations rose and fell like tides, laughter spiked in corners, servers threaded the spaces with practiced choreography. The weight of his tray felt natural in his hands. The subtle shift in balance as glasses emptied and were replaced was as familiar as his own heartbeat. Then Preston's gaze found him. It was only a flicker across the crowd at first, but it lingered, assessing, calculating. Henry moved to the next table, offering champagne to a couple discussing a ski trip to Aspen, but he could feel the attention on his back like a spotlight. When the last of the guests were seated and the hum of conversation softened, Preston stepped up to the microphone at the head table. His voice, warm and commanding, carried easily over the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "thank you for joining Caroline and me tonight. We are truly honored to be surrounded by such remarkable people leaders, innovators, dear friends, each of you a part of our journey." The applause that followed was polite, expectant. Henry continued to circulate, refilling glasses, staying in motion. Preston went on. "Success in life comes from understanding your place, from recognizing what truly matters. We've invited people tonight who represent the very best of what our society offers." Henry felt the subtle shift in the air, a turn in tone that made him pause near a side table. Conversations stopped. Preston's words had taken on an edge, a narrowing of focus. "And," Preston continued, "it's also important to acknowledge that not everyone reaches the same heights. Not everyone matters equally." A murmur passed through the room, confusion knitting brows. Henry kept his eyes on the glasses before him, but the prickle at the back of his neck was impossible to ignore. "Take this man, for instance," Preston said, and Henry felt the room pivot toward him before he even looked up. "Henry Whittaker. He's just a waiter. Never amounted to anything significant. A man who peaked in his 20s and has spent 40 years sliding downhill." The champagne bottle in Henry's hand was suddenly heavier, but his grip stayed steady. Caroline's face had gone pale, her mouth opening in silent shock. Around them, guests shifted uncomfortably, some glancing between Preston and Henry, others staring down at their plates. "He wants to be part of this celebration," Preston pressed on. "But the truth is there are makers, and there are servers, leaders and followers, people who matter, and people who simply exist to facilitate the lives of those who do." Henry set the bottle down on the nearest table with deliberate care. He straightened his vest and looked at the nearest guest. "Would anyone like more champagne?" he asked evenly. A woman nodded quickly, relief flashing in her eyes at the interruption. Henry poured, his movements precise, unhurried. He moved to the next table, the next guest, each pour a quiet defiance. The silence around Preston thickened, his momentum faltering. He'd expected a reaction, anger, embarrassment, maybe even an exit. Instead, Henry gave him nothing but the professionalism of a man doing his job. It was then that a voice near the bar cut through. "Wait a second," a young man said, pointing toward the television mounted on the wall. "Isn't that him?" Heads turned toward the screen where a black and white film was playing. A younger Henry filled the frame, dressed in a naval uniform, speaking lines with a quiet intensity that pulled the viewer in. "That's him," another guest confirmed. "Henry Whittaker. He was in 7 films between 1988 and 1995. Golden Globe nomination for Atlantic Crossing." The shift in the room was immediate. Phones appeared. Searches began. Guests murmured to each other, recalling old movies, scenes, performances. An older woman near the head table looked from the screen to Henry, her expression softening with recognition. Caroline's eyes were wide now, but not with shock. She was seeing him differently, understanding something she hadn't before. Preston remained frozen at the microphone, his grip on it tightening. The power he'd tried to wield was slipping through his fingers. Guests began to rise, moving toward Henry with handshakes, questions, warm smiles. He answered them with humility, but his gaze stayed on Preston, holding it just long enough for the truth to settle. Whatever story Preston had tried to tell about him had just been rewritten in front of every person who mattered to him. Now he understands who he's dealing with. They thought the paperwork was a formality until I slid the folder across the table and watched their faces fall. The morning after the gala, the winter sun came in low through Henry's kitchen window, turning the steam from his coffee into pale ribbons. The old house was quiet, the kind of silence that comes after a storm, not peace exactly, but a stillness that feels like a held breath. He sat at the worn oak table, flipping through a thin stack of documents that had been gathering dust in his safe for years. Each page was a reminder that patience, properly applied, could be sharper than any blade. He had not intended to play this card. Not yet. But Preston had forced the hand. Public humiliation in front of that room, in front of Caroline, had cut deeper than anything before. And Henry was done playing the part they'd written for him. A decade ago, when Caroline was still finishing her business degree, she had come to him in tears over the ballooning cost of tuition. Preston was just a name then, a boyfriend she claimed was good for her. Henry had dipped into his retirement savings, then sold a portion of land behind his house to pay off her student loans in full. But the money had come with an agreement, legal, notarized, granting him a small ownership stake in any business she started for the first 20 years. At the time, Caroline had signed without hesitation. "You're investing in me," she'd said, hugging him, "and I'll never forget it." He turned the last page now and smiled without warmth. Never forget, indeed. The document was airtight, drafted by an old friend of his who specialized in corporate law. It gave Henry the right to access the company's financial books at will, to audit any transfer of assets, and most crucially to halt any sale or restructuring without his approval. In short, Preston couldn't so much as sell a desk without Henry's signature. By noon, Henry was walking into the glass-walled offices of Whittaker and Wells, the law firm where his friend Eleanor Wells still kept a corner office with a view of the city. She looked up from her desk and raised an eyebrow. "I haven't seen this in years," she said, flipping through the file. "I want to exercise every right in there," Henry said simply. Eleanor smiled in that slow, knowing way of hers. "Then you're going to need an appointment with the board." That appointment came sooner than he expected. 2 days later, he walked into the company conference room, its long table polished to a mirror shine. Preston sat at the head, Caroline to his right. The other board members, a mix of family investors and longtime friends of Preston's, looked mildly irritated at the interruption. Preston's voice was smooth as silk. "Henry, we appreciate you stopping by, but we have a busy agenda." Henry slid the folder across the table. "Then you'll want to start with this." Caroline's hand hesitated before she pulled it closer, her eyes scanning the first page. Her face paled. Preston's didn't change at first, but the set of his jaw tightened. By the third page, the murmur of side conversations had gone silent. "This can't be valid," Preston said finally, his voice sharp now. "It's valid," Eleanor said from the far end of the table, her tone as crisp as the documents. "Filed, recorded, and enforceable." "What exactly are you trying to do here?" one of the board members asked. Henry met Preston's eyes. "I'm reminding everyone that this business started with my sacrifice, and I'm making sure it stays in hands that respect that." The tension in the room thickened. Preston leaned back, lacing his fingers together as if trying to regain control. "You're bluffing," he said. Henry let the silence answer for him. One of the board members, a woman in a green silk blouse, cleared her throat. "If this is binding, then any strategic decisions we've made without his sign-off could be problematic." "More than problematic," Eleanor added. "Potentially void." Preston's gaze was ice now. "You're making a mistake," he said. Henry stood, gathering the room's attention. "The mistake," he said evenly, "was assuming I'd given everything I had to give." He paused just long enough to let the words land. "I'm only getting started." Caroline's eyes met his, then uncertain, searching, but he didn't let himself soften. "Not here. Not yet." Preston's hand curled into a fist against the table, the only crack in his polished exterior. Henry took the moment to turn toward the door, his voice steady. "I'll expect the full financials by Monday." He stepped out into the hallway, the murmur of stunned voices following him like a shadow. And waiting there, leaning casually against the wall, was a reporter Henry recognized from the business section of the local paper. The man smiled faintly. "Mr. Whitaker," he said, holding up a small recorder, "care to comment on why Preston Hargrove's company just went into emergency session?" In the end, Henry's journey was never truly about corporate control or financial leverage. It was about respect, something he had given freely for years, even when it was returned with arrogance and disregard. For decades, he had poured himself into the lives of those he loved, often without a second thought, trusting that sacrifice would be remembered, honored, and reciprocated. Instead, he learned the painful truth that love without respect is simply exploitation dressed in softer words. Yet this truth did not destroy him. It rebuilt him. What began as a quiet endurance turned into a steady awakening. Every late-night worry about bills while helping Caroline with her tuition, every holiday spent alone because she was too busy, every moment when Preston's smugness went unchecked, all of it became the foundation of his resolve. He came to see that patience does not mean passivity, and forgiveness does not mean surrender. The final act placing those documents on the boardroom table was not a sudden act of vengeance, but the culmination of years of unspoken strength. Henry had been underestimated for so long, that his power, once revealed, was all the more devastating. The look in Preston's eyes, the silence that spread across that polished table, the shift in Carolyn's face, all of it told him that the balance had changed. He was no longer the man they could dismiss. And yet, Henry's victory was not about humiliation for its own sake. It was about setting a boundary so clear it could never be mistaken for weakness again. He did not need to scream, to threaten, or to gloat. His actions spoke louder than any insult ever could. The terms were simple: respect my role, respect my sacrifices, or watch everything you built on my back collapse. This was not the lesson Henry had wanted to teach his daughter, but it was the one life demanded. He had hoped to show her that loyalty and gratitude are the currency of family, more valuable than any balance sheet. But when that currency is counterfeited with entitlement and deceit, you must protect what is yours. The real victory came not in the legal hold he had over the company, but in reclaiming his own narrative. For too long, Preston had cast him as the aging, irrelevant benefactor, useful only when writing a check, invisible otherwise. Now Henry stood as an equal force, one whose sacrifices were finally acknowledged, even if only through gritted teeth. He realized something profound in the quiet after that meeting. Dignity is not given by others. It is claimed, defended, and kept. The moment you allow someone to chip away at it, they will take the whole foundation. But when you stand your ground, even the most arrogant must pause. In the weeks that followed, whispers circulated through the business community. Preston's grip on the company loosened, board members began to question his judgment, and Caroline's tone softened in her calls to her father. She asked about dinners, about spending time together. But Henry, though polite, kept his boundaries intact. Trust, he knew, was not rebuilt in a day. He spent more time with people who valued him without condition: old friends, his sister Margaret, and the neighbors who had always respected him. There was laughter at his kitchen table again, the smell of coffee brewing on slow Sunday mornings. The comfort of knowing the company's fate no longer dictated his peace of mind. What he learned was simple, yet hard-won. The people who truly love you will never ask you to shrink so they can stand taller. Those who do must be shown that your worth is not up for negotiation. Henry's story is not a blueprint for revenge, but a testament to the quiet power of preparation and principle. It is about knowing when to wait, when to act, and when to walk away. He did not destroy Preston's empire for spite. He preserved the part of it that was rightfully his, ensuring his sacrifices had meaning. For every parent who has been taken for granted, Henry's stand is a reminder. Your kindness is not weakness, and your patience is not permission. You are allowed to draw the line. You are allowed to demand respect. And you are allowed to choose peace over proximity when family forgets what family means. The philosophy remains: respect yourself enough to protect what you've built, even if that means standing alone. If you felt the weight of Henry's journey, if you know the quiet sting of being underestimated, then you understand why this ending matters. If you believe that self-respect is worth defending, no matter the cost, leave a comment with the number 1. And do not forget to subscribe to our channel to hear the next story, because there are countless others who, like Henry, found the strength to rise.